When we think about the kinetics of a reaction, we're talking about how fast that reaction happens. When we see a balanced chemical reaction, such as this one on the screen, the combustion of propane, you might be tempted to think that it happens in the manner that it's written as it's balanced. In other words, you might think one propane molecule bumps into 5 oxygens and out pops 3 carbon dioxides and 4 waters. And that just is not true. It doesn't happen that way. Whenever we see a balanced chemical reaction, the stoichiometry of it is not necessarily what's literally happening as the molecules bump into each other, collide with each other, and undergo the chemical reaction. It doesn't necessarily work that way. How it does work is related to the rate law for this reaction. And the rate law for this reaction has to be determined experimentally by monitoring the concentrations of the reacting species and the rates of the reaction, and then figuring out, is it first order, second order, third order, maybe 0th order with respect to each of the reactants. And that has to be done experimentally. And we don't find that this reaction is first order in propane and 5th order in oxygen. The orders for the rate law do not necessarily correspond to the balancing coefficients. So what do the orders correspond to? Well, now we're talking about looking at a mechanism for a reaction. A mechanism is a set of elementary steps, simple chemical reactions that literally do represent who's bumping into what and what is resulting from that bumping into each other. It's a series of steps which would ultimately lead to this reaction overall. So we would see the series of steps which would give us this balanced reaction overall. The mechanism is something that is very theoretical in nature. A mechanism can never be proved absolutely. A mechanism is something that a scientist devises based on the given experimental evidence that seems to make sense. So when you see a mechanism given for a reaction, this is our scientist's best guess at literally how this reaction proceeds, who bumps into whom, what pops out, based on experimental evidence. So let's look at an example of a mechanism, a proposed mechanism. When we take this into the lab, we can determine an experimental rate law, and what we find is that this reaction is first order with respect to N2O5. So as the balanced reaction, we do see a 2 to balance the overall reaction, but this is not a second order reaction as determined experimentally, it's just a first order reaction. If this were a second order reaction, what that would mean, if we did have a squared on the N2O5, is that would literally mean 2 N2O5s would need to come and bounce off of each other in order for this reaction to proceed. If we have a first order process, that means literally what's happening is one molecule is undergoing some sort of rearrangement. Bonds are being broken in that molecule so that it can then go on and form the products. That gives us the evidence that we need to propose a mechanism for this reaction. Knowing that it's first order gives us some insight into what might be happening. So what scientists have done is they have proposed a mechanism. I'm going to drag it in. All right, so here we see a proposed mechanism, and this is essentially how they'll look. They're composed of more than one step. This one has 3 steps. There might be more than 3 steps. Each step is what we call an elementary reaction. So these are elementary reactions. The steps are labeled as either slow or fast. That gives us an indication kinetically of how fast they're happening, and these are relative to each other. And overall, if I add up all of the steps in the mechanism, I should come up with the reaction for which this is the mechanism. When I add these reactions, the arrows are like the equal sign. Anything that shows up on both the left and the right gets canceled. So notice I am left with the reaction I started with. That's the first thing. The mechanism has to agree with the overall reaction. Once you've determined that it agrees with the overall reaction, that's a step toward justifying that mechanism. Another thing, or just some vocabulary associated with it, each of these elementary reactions or elementary steps for the mechanism are literally what is bumping in with something else. And again, these are proposed steps. This is proposed based on experimental evidence. We can never prove a mechanism correct, but we can prove it wrong by doing certain experiments. So we're proposing this mechanism for this overall reaction, and what that would say is in this first step I have one N2O5 molecule that is undergoing a rearrangement, and it's breaking into three parts. It's breaking into two NO fragments and an O3 fragment. Now notice that both of these parts get consumed in the second step. The second step says that these three parts all bump into each other to produce two NO2s and an oxygen atom. The NO and the O3 that gets produced in this first step, these are called intermediates. They're intermediates because they get consumed in a later step and therefore they cancel. All right? In the second step, they all three bump into each other and produce two NO2s and an oxygen atom, and the oxygen atom gets consumed in the third step. So oxygen atom is also an intermediate. So I have three intermediates in this proposed mechanism. So intermediates are formed in an early step in the mechanism and then get consumed later on. The slow step in the proposed mechanism must agree with the rate law, in which case this does, because this proposes that one N2O5 undergoes this rearrangement, and that's the slow step, and that agrees with the first order rate law. An elementary reaction, an elementary step in a mechanism that has one reacting species leads to a first order rate law for that individual step. The second step would lead to an overall third order rate law for this individual step, second order in NO and first order in O3. And then this third step would lead to a second order overall rate law, first order in N2O5 and first order in O. But both of these happen very quickly relative to the first step, so it is the rate law of this first step which governs the rate law for the overall reaction. And that's another justification of the mechanism, is that these two have to agree. The slow steps rate law has to agree with the overall experimentally determined rate law. Now, one thing about these elementary reactions, one molecular species rearranging, splitting up, that's certainly possible. Two elementary species, two molecular species bumping into each other to form products, again, that's very possible, that's very likely. But in step number 2, we have three species, two NO molecular particles and an O3 molecular particle. Those three must bump into each other at the same time with the proper orientation, with sufficient energy to go on and form these products. And the minute you hit an elementary step that is termolecular, three molecules coming together, the odds of it happening go down. Now, in this case, since those three particles were just formed in the first step, well, they're all going to be relatively close to each other, so maybe this proposed mechanism isn't that far off, because we can kind of see how maybe they would. But again, this is part of the guessing process. These three steps that I've shown you are not necessarily the latest proposed mechanism for the reaction of N2O5, but it is a proposed mechanism. All right, let's look at one more proposed mechanism for one more reaction and point out some features that we didn't see on this one. All right, in this case, I'm giving you the proposed mechanism. Notice it involves some ions. That's possible. I'm giving you the proposed mechanism first, and for example, I might suggest, what is the overall reaction? I might ask, what is the overall reaction that this is the proposed mechanism for? In which case we would add these three steps together. Is that it? I think so. So here is my overall reaction. So I'm looking at this overall reaction, and I am proposing a mechanism for this overall reaction. One thing I just realized got left off is that it is proposed that this first step is fast, the second step is slow, and the third step is fast. This proposed mechanism includes some intermediates, like we saw in the last mechanism. An intermediate is a substance that is produced and then later consumed. Notice that the AlCl4 negative is produced in the first step and then consumed in the third step. So my intermediates include AlCl4 with a negative sign. The CH3CH2 plus also falls into this category, and the H plus falls into this category. Notice that there's something else that we canceled that isn't included in the intermediate list. This AlCl3 is consumed in the first step. It's not an intermediate. It doesn't get produced as part of one of my elementary steps. It's actually added to the reaction, and then in this last step, in a later step, it gets spit back out. This is a catalyst. A catalyst is something that is added to the reaction that causes it to go faster but is not actually consumed itself. So it does get canceled in this chemical reaction. We add it first, it is spit back out later. And so this would be my catalyst. So I could label my catalysts and my intermediates, I could find my overall reaction, and I know that experimentally my rate law must agree with the slow step, which would indicate that I am first order with respect to C6H6 and first order with respect to an intermediate. Now typically we don't write experimental rate laws with respect to intermediates, but we can see that the intermediate is related to the CH3CH2Cl consumption in this first step. So the production of it is related inversely to the consumption, if you will, of this. And so we can see if our experimental rate law is related in such a fashion. The catalyst, just to wrap up a little bit about what the catalyst does, is the catalyst is something that is added to the reaction and makes it go faster and is not itself consumed, like our AlCl3. So let's talk about what that looks like. Why does a catalyst make the reaction go faster? All right. You may recall we talked about the energy diagram for a reaction. If we look at energy versus time on, for example, an exothermic reaction, we have reactants over here. We have an activation energy, which is an input of energy that is required for the reaction to take place. It is defined as the distance or the magnitude from the reactants to the top of the curve, the transition state of the complex. And now we know that it's often a series of steps, a mechanism, and so this picture is actually an oversimplification of what might actually look like the energy diagram. There might be 3 steps before you go on and form your products, for example. So from reactants to products, it might require 3 steps with some intermediates in between, and each one of the steps would have its own activation energy, but the activation energy for the reaction would be defined as the energy to get to the peak of the energy. What a catalyst does when you add it is it gives the reactants an alternative path to form products. It gives you a different mechanism. And for example, we add a catalyst to this reaction, there might only be 2 steps, and overall these 2 steps would have a lower activation energy than the first path. The first path is uncatalyzed, the second path is catalyzed, and the second path has a lower activation energy. A lower activation energy means less energy is needed to form products, which means the reaction is going to go faster.